There was something about Jimmy Stewart that made people believe in goodness, in honesty, in the quiet strength of a man who seemed to carry America's soul in his smile. He was the man who reminded people that decency still existed, on screen and off. But behind that gentle voice and charming laugh lay a story of heartbreak, loss, and unspoken pain. This is the tragic life of Jimmy Stewart. He was born James Maitland Stewart on May 20, 1908, in the small town of Indiana, Pennsylvania. Jimmy was one of the first major stars to enlist, not for publicity, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. He left behind Hollywood glamour for the harsh reality of the skies. As a U.S. Army Air Force pilot, he flew dangerous bombing missions over Nazi Germany. The war left deep scars. He witnessed death, destruction, and the loss of young men he had sworn to protect. When he returned home in 1945, Jimmy was not the same man. His once bright eyes carried the weight of the battlefield. He suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and depression, symptoms of what we now know as PTSD. But back then, men didn't talk about such things. Then came It's a Wonderful Life, the movie that would become a Christmas classic. Few knew it was filmed during one of the darkest times of his life. Behind every emotional scene, every tear, every cry, was Jimmy's real pain coming through. It wasn't until years later that It's a Wonderful Life was recognized as one of the greatest films ever made. By then, Jimmy had already faced more heartbreak than most men could bear. He finally found love with actress Gloria McLean in 1949. For the first time, Jimmy smiled again. They built a beautiful family together, twin daughters, a loving home, and a quiet life away from Hollywood's chaos. But even in happiness, life was preparing more tragedy. Jimmy had always been deeply patriotic. His stepson, Ronald McLean, followed in his footsteps and joined the Air Force. But in 1969, during the Vietnam War, Ronald was killed in action. That day, something inside Jimmy Stewart broke forever. He never spoke publicly about it, but friends said he cried for days, refusing to eat or leave his room. The man who once brought hope to millions could no longer find it for himself. Still, he carried on, making films, smiling for fans, keeping his pain hidden behind quiet dignity. He often said, "I'm just an average man who believes in doing what's right." But behind those simple words was a lifetime of sacrifice, loss, and courage few could ever understand. Hollywood had changed. The golden age was fading, and new faces were taking over. But for Jimmy, it wasn't about fame anymore. He had seen the world, lost people he loved, and realized that true happiness was not in applause, but in peace. He preferred spending his time at home in Beverly Hills with his beloved wife, Gloria, and their children. Neighbors often recalled seeing him in his garden, feeding birds, or quietly reading on the porch. To the world, he was a legend, but at home, he was simply Jim. She had a way of grounding him, reminding him that life was about family, not fame. Theirs was one of Hollywood's most enduring marriages, built on love, respect, and shared values. But as time went on, tragedy struck once again. In the early 1990s, Gloria fell seriously ill. The woman who had given Jimmy hope and happiness was now slipping away. He spent nearly every day by her bedside, holding her hand, whispering to her softly, even when she could no longer respond. When she passed away in 1994, Jimmy was devastated. Friends said he was never the same again. He stopped appearing in public, stopped attending events, and rarely left his home. He told one friend quietly, "I just want to be with Gloria again." In those final years, Jimmy's world grew smaller. He spent most days in quiet reflection, watching old westerns, listening to music, and thinking about the past. Reporters who occasionally visited him described a man who still smiled politely, but whose eyes were filled with distant sadness. It was as if the memories of his youth, the laughter, the fame, the love, were fading into the shadows of time. When asked about It's a Wonderful Life, he would simply nod and say, "That movie is about hope. I think we all need a little of that." But inside, hope was something Jimmy had already given to the world, even when he had little left for himself. As the century turned, Jimmy's health began to decline. He suffered from heart problems and other complications that come with age. Yet, he refused hospitalization, saying he wanted to stay in his home, the place filled with Gloria's memory. On July 2, 1997, the world lost one of its greatest screen legends. James Maitland Stewart passed away peacefully at the age of 89. He was buried beside his beloved Gloria at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Tom Hanks called him the last true gentleman of Hollywood. Frank Capra once said, "He represented what was best in all of us." Even today, decades later, Jimmy Stewart's legacy lives on, not just in the films that made us laugh and cry, but in the way he carried himself, humble, honest, and human. Instrumental of Auld Lang Syne returns, gentle and nostalgic when you watch It's a Wonderful Life and see George Bailey standing there, tears streaming down his face, realizing how much he matters. Remember this. That was Jimmy Stewart. That was his heart. That was his truth. He lived a life filled with triumph and tragedy. He gave everything to his country, his art, and his family. And even when life took so much from him, he never lost the quiet dignity that made him who he was. Jimmy Stewart once said, "I'm just a fella who believes in kindness. You try to be good to people. That's all there is." Perhaps that's why, even in his loneliness, his light never truly went out, because a life built on kindness is never really over. This was the story of a man who taught us that courage isn't loud, it's quiet, that love doesn't end, it lingers, and that every life, no matter how ordinary or tragic, can be wonderful.